Scientifically, technically, flow is defined as an optimal state of consciousness where we feel our best and perform our best. Whatever the case, wherever you go, people always talk about flow. The secret is always flow. And science, of course, backs that up. I also think the future is humans in flow collaborating with AI. So I think that's really important to understand that there are a bunch of things that happen to the brain in flow that allow us to cooperate better with AI.
Thought control is a crazy concept. I mean, the idea that we can potentially control our thoughts, our emotions, our feelings, self-regulation, it's something that when I first discovered it, I was like, that's possible. Today, you're going to meet someone who actually is very familiar with this concept, who's going to introduce you to an entire concept of flow. What actually makes up peak performance? How do we get into a flow state? And how can we optimize ourselves to achieve our desired outcomes? Today, I'm very humbled to introduce an incredible best-selling author of numerous books, the one, the only, Mr. Stephen Kotler. How are you today, sir?
Good to be with you, Jonathan.
I think an optimal place to start would be, what is flow, and how did you start to get into this whole rabbit hole of discovering what flow is?
Let me give you a couple of definitions. So scientifically, technically, flow is defined as an optimal state of consciousness where we feel our best and perform our best. That doesn't get anybody very far, though. More specifically, it refers to any of those moments of rapt attention and total absorption. You get so focused on what you're doing on the task at hand, everything else just starts to melt away and disappear. So time will pass strangely. You'll get so sucked into what you're doing that 5 hours go by in what feels like 5 minutes. Your sense of self, self-consciousness, the inner critic, that voice in your head gets really, really quiet, going away altogether. And throughout all aspects of performance, and that's mental, physical, and emotional, go through the roof, which is why we say flow sits at the heart of human peak performance, because everybody's designed to get into flow. This is how evolution shaped humans to perform at their best. So it's a built-in feature, so anybody can use flow to up-level performance. There's like 11 to 15 different origin stories, so you can sort of take your pick. But there's sort of two big ones. And the first that I think is more relevant to other people, though people like the biographical story better, but I'm going to tell you the other one.
Okay.
In the early 1990s, I started out as a journalist. I was really, was very geeked about neuroscience. Neuroscience in the early 1990s went from like, what is this cluster of neurons called and what might it be doing, to topics you talked about when you introduced me. Questions about consciousness and altered states of consciousness, which flow is, psychedelics and psychedelic therapy, all these things off limits to science, emotions even, for a very long time, became real topics for neuroscience. Really caught my attention. I was also an action sport athlete, and this is the early 1990s, so action sports aren't really a thing yet. The X Games haven't happened, the Gravity Games. It's really like this sort of very it's a deep punk rock subculture is really what it is. I was writing about action sports in the early days, all of them: surfing, skiing, rock climbing, snowboarding, the like. Living in these communities at the time, I was living in Squaw Valley, what's today known as Palisades, Tahoe. And it was a lot of my friends and that were involved in kind of what became free skiing and free snowboarding and everything else, but was then extreme skiing and extreme snowboarding. And you know anything about the 1990s in action sports, people talk about this era as the era of more impossible feats get done than ever before, right? And it's the first question is, of course, like, what the hell's going on, right? And it's really, I always say it's a really different thing. You can see a crazy feat on a screen and it's one thing, but when like you go drinking with your friends on a Friday night, then everybody wakes up hungover Saturday morning, and you go into the mountains and your friends do something that for all of recorded history, people believed impossible. People thought you would die if you did. And then it's your friends pulling it off. It's a very strange thing. But what really had my attention, and this is, I think, the point that matters, is back then, especially, if you were to talk about peak human performance, you hear a lot of things, but you'd hear a lot about, especially if you're talking about young athletes, having the right coaches, going to the right schools, having the right parents, right? Having the right upbringing, having money for the sport and for the coaching and for the training. None of those things were present in the athletes I knew. They came from like bad childhoods, really bad childhoods, awful childhoods. There were a lot of people from broken homes. Nobody had a ton of education, or it was rare in this community. Nobody had any money. and risk-taking was through the roof, and substance abuse was through the roof. And normally you put those things together in a community and people die young and go to jail. What they don't do is reinvent what's possible for the human species. So the question was, what the hell is going on? How is this happening? It didn't matter which sport I looked at and which athlete I talked to. Whenever you saw the impossible become possible, the story they came back with was a story about flow, right? Of being so immersed in what they were doing that everything else had disappeared. And they merged with the mountain and all this stuff. And it was across the boards in all these sports. I started to really focus my work on what is flow, where's it coming from, and I took that from being a journalist to then writing books. I think I've now written 7 to 9 books about flow from different angles. I've gone from looking at flow in action sport athletes to looking at flow in every single domain. Whenever you see sort of given performance impossible become possible, this could be technology. I was in the room when the very first bionic eye was turned on, the very first time in history. A blind man could see the very first bionic limbs when they were invented, early AI, all these kinds of inventions, early space travel. You talk to the people who were behind them, were business leaders like Elon Musk and Larry Page and Jeff Bezos, who I wrote about in Bold. Whatever the case, wherever you go, people always talk about flow. The secret is always flow. And science, of course, backs that up. These were still early days and a lot wasn't known. Flow had 1 million names at that point, right? It was in the zone, runner's high, being unconscious, being in the pocket, peak performance, peak. I mean, like it was literally like every 10 years, somebody had a new name. We didn't know anything about this. Some people thought it was a fairy tale. I remember interviewing early action sport athletes and trying to figure out how the hell am I going to get them to talk about flow without thinking I'm crazy. Like we laugh about it now, but you couldn't. I remember sitting with Laird Hamilton. He was 30 years old. He had just turned 30. I was like 27. And Laird is at that point like the king of the world, like the toughest man on earth is widely. I think it's Mike Tyson had the title and Laird took it from him in a sense because nobody had ever seen anything like big wave surfing. It was so terrifying. And Laird was so clearly the king of it. He started talking about flow with me in this interview. We had this conversation. I felt like, oh my God, it's this secret language. Nobody else talks about this. I used to, in the early days, I would have to call neuroscientists and talk for like 30 minutes about flow before I could ask them questions because it was that like far away. But anyways, that's how I got into it.
Reading your book, The Art of Impossible, and the research that goes into the Flow Research Collective, you just covered so much, and I want to do my best to unpack, right? We talked about AI, we talked about the discovery of flow, groundbreaking insights and conversations that you had firsthand from high performers. I'm going to steal a page out of your book. When did you first start thinking about the problem this way?
Yeah, really early on for 2 reasons. So the first thing I saw was I'm like everybody else who ever was interested in peak performance and all the people who sort of grow up to be coaches or, work in these fields. You learn a little bit about the thing and then you try to teach it to people. And so this is what I did. I was interested in the neurobiology, but we didn't know how to train from the neurobiology yet. We knew how to train from the psychology. And that's what was still going on. And people were trying to use psychology. And I tried to help is a loose term, but I tried to work with some friends of mine and people I knew, and I was a fucking disaster. I made a disaster of people's lives. One guy in the hospital, another friend almost went to jail, nearly got a couple divorced, who are still married today, by the way. I mean, I was a disaster in people's lives. And it wasn't just me. There were other attempts to train flow out of the psychology. Some people were really successful with it. Toyota had found a way to start weaving it into their corporate philosophy. Jimmy Johnson quoted plain flow was the reason. So Bill Clinton had talked about flow. Tony Blair, who was then running England, had talked about flow. So we had these big names talking about flow. But you could go back to the 90s and Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, the godfather of flow psychology, and a brilliant sports psychologist named Susan Jackson had tried to use psychology to train flow. They weren't any good at it either. So I saw firsthand, hey, wait a minute. The psychology is too squishy. It's too subjective. It's too individual. Now we know why that is, right? We can talk about things like introversion, extroversion, risk tolerances, and all these things that we understand are neurobiological and really shape how you want to train peak performance. But then we really didn't know those things. I just had this firsthand experience of trying to figure out what worked for me and I was trying to teach to other people, and I wrecked their lives. And I was like, okay, that doesn't work. That's not going to work. Let's look at the neurobiology because it's a basic biological mechanism. It's shaped by evolution. It's shared by all humans. And I had this hunch that if we could roll things deeper to the neurobiology, and this was, you have to understand that very little was known. When I started this work, we thought flow had something to do with endorphins. And I was part of a handful of people who were saying, no, 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 it's more than that. There's more going on. Take a look at blah, blah, blah. And it turned out to be a whole lot more going on. And we now, when you look at the neurobiological, neurophysiological definition of flow, it's got like 30 things that we look for. And there are really clear tags that show flow in the brain and things like that. None of that was known then. But I just knew that trying to help people working on the psychology was doing more damage than good. And I maintain this still to this day. I think that most coaches screw up because they figure out what works for them. They try to teach to other people. Psychologists are a little better, but usually they find a model that they relate to and they coach from it. And if you talk to most psychologists, my problem with the models is they start with the models and then maybe 5 years down, they're going to say, well, what's the neurobiology under the model? And to me, that's ass backwards, right? Like, I don't get that at all. It doesn't make any sense. And I haven't seen it be effective from a tactical, practical. We with the Flow Research Collective, I train people in 156 countries, or something like that, in 28 industries all over the world. And so I need something that works everywhere, right? It's got to work in Mumbai. It's got to work in China. It's got to work in Chicago. And it's got to work for men, women, young, old, across the board. And that's what the neurobiology gives us. And so it was a long time, going from what is this thing to where we are today, which is writing papers about what's exactly going on in the brain at now we're at the network level. That's the work my lab does. We do computational neuroscience, and it's the network level of activity in the brain.
I believe there's a sentiment that you have at the Flow Research Collective. What is it? Personality fails, biology scales, something along those lines?
You just, I got, all I've got is yours, and yours is better. Personality fails, biology scales. You kicked it out of my mind. I was like, oh, that's really good. That's not what I say. But it's really good. But that's the exact, hi, Kiko. Hello. Yes, you're on camera. It's always a problem. And I don't, it really, it bothers me a great deal because I see coaches doing it all the time and they're charging a lot of money. You know what I mean? It's a lot of money, and it's really easy to sort of wreck somebody's life that way. So anyways, rant over, off my soapbox.
I think it's still important to have the conversation, though, because for me, it's very enlightening. I mean, I'm going through the book and, I've studied your content and your work at length. When I hear you talk about it firsthand, obviously it resonates differently because now I have the opportunity. I mean, with your journalistic background, you completely understand. If you want to develop an expertise and you outline an incredible framework in The Art of Impossible as to how you can cultivate an expertise from the different types of books that you can read to develop a certain level of fluency, picking up on the parlance and the jargon and all of the different things that come along with learning how to ask the right questions of the right people, to really go down deep and understand at depth what the area of expertise that you want to refine. My kind of curiosity is, when you, as a professional, as someone who's written about this topic, as an authority on the topic, how do you define an authority or an expert based on your research and work?
Awesome question. Thank you for asking that. So I talk a lot about, and as you know, in Art of Impossible, one of the elements I think for peak performance, because there's a big cognitive element for peak performance, and one of the things, especially true in the modern world, right, in today's world, you got to be able to assess information very quickly, and you have to have a way of assessing information, and so a way of thinking about expertise. And there are really well established ways of doing this, the scientific method, right? You come up with your idea, you test it, and then you publish it, and you let other people beat on it. And if they say good things and you follow it up with good art, right, then you go talk about it. I always tell my people I work with, everybody at the Flow Research Collective, the order of the process is insight, research, publication, communication. Most people, especially like these thought leaders, whatever the hell that means, they have an insight and they get on Instagram and they tell the world about, oh, I had a download. It's a joke to me. I'm just, okay, you had a download. I have downloads all day long. Everybody I know has downloads all day long. Like, we call that thinking here. I don't know what this is, but go beat on your download for a while and test it and then publish it so other smart people can beat on it. When I was a journalist, I'll tell you a true story. Boy, did I learn my lesson on this one. So I wrote a story on the neurobiology of mystical experiences for a big science magazine that will go unnamed. And I asked 3 experts a question, and they all gave me the same answer. And I basically said, why is the science of near death and out of body experiences not farther along? We know from Gallup research that 10% of the population has had near death experiences and like 20% has had out of body experiences. That's gigantic. This is an enormous swatch of people. Why don't we know more about this stuff? I don't get it. And they all said, well, so-and-so wrote this popular book about the subject, and it was a bestseller, and he was not a great scientist, and it sort of ruined the scientific credibility of the field. And they all gave me the same name. In journalism, when I write for the New York Times or anybody else, if 3 experts give you the same fact, you can publish it. It's true. That's how you fact check things. It turns out all 3 of them had given me the same wrong name. Swear to God. They gave me the wrong name, and I slandered a scientist who I deeply actually respect. And my editors flipped because it got past the copy editor, got into print, and the scientist was fucking pissed. And I felt like a rube, and I didn't work again for that publication for like another 10 years. They were so mad. So I started to realize you want to talk to 5 people. And if you get turned around, like the 4th or the 5th person will tell you something totally different than everybody else. And so I don't feel like I have any expertise until I've gotten totally turned around on a subject a couple of times. That's how I know, okay, you really know a thing or two. How I judge outside experts are with the same filters, right? And I'm cautious. So like, you got to understand that the world looks different inside a field than outside a field, right? Outside a field, you think, oh, this got published in a scientific journal. It must be real. And scientists look at this stuff, and our journals are rated. How much we trust them, how open they are to ideas. Are they an open source journal? Can anybody publish in them? Who's reviewing? All those things. So I'm actually a big fan of gatekeepers when it comes to information. I liked having magazines where there was fact checkers and there were people saying, these are good ideas. These are smart people who could hammer on stuff. I liked it when newspapers didn't report on like stuff that shows up on Twitter as news. Like that, all that stuff is insane to me, and I don't get it. Which is why I don't get any news. There's a couple of news sources that I trust, and forget it. The rest is just turned off all the time.
Especially in this day and age, right, where we have to audit and question everything. Because like you said, everyone has a download. We have to be mindful of what expertise we're willing to assign our trust to.
I will tell you on my end, and people hate when I say this, but I really don't think I was an expert in flow until I started publishing and doing actual scientific research. Which was a lot more recently. Past 10 years, then a lot of people decided I was an expert in flow long before I was willing to do it. And I'll give you, put an exclamation point on this for you. So I wrote 2 books about flow before I actually had an opinion. If you read West to Jesus or A Small Furry Prayer, I ask a lot of questions. And I try to summarize ideas, but I don't have an opinion. It wasn't until Rise of Superman and I had been studying this topic at the neurobiological level for 10, 15 years at that point, that I actually had an opinion about something. That's what I think it takes to become an expert in something. And even then, I was a couple years away from really launching my first scientific studies into flow. And that's when I sort of okay, now you know what you're talking about.
It's so fascinating to me because the regard that you have to hold yourself in order to give yourself permission to contribute to the conversation, right? Where you have like all of these like you said, coaches out there telling everyone contribute to the conversation, redefining what expertise is. You could just read one book, call yourself an expert, right?
I'll give you a different one that's really common today, and it's baffling to me. So I meet a lot of podcasters who think they're an expert on their subject because they've interviewed a couple hundred experts on the subject. And that's stunning to me. I was a journalist for 15 years. I worked on neurobiology for 15 years and wrote about it for everybody. I did way more than 200 interviews, thousands. Was I an expert? No, I was a journalist. Like, I was a journalist. I was a reporter. There was no reason I could stand up on stage and claim to be anything other than somebody who learned from others' expertise and turned them into stories. That was the job for a very long time. I don't know if I got to say they're not an expert. You know what I mean? When I meet people like that, I'm like, wow, that was not my generation's criteria for this. It was different. And it feels a lot looser today. And maybe that's a good thing because we get more interesting ideas into the mix. And I'm a big fan of that. That's how we get novelty and innovation. But I'm also, as I said, a fan of gatekeepers. And I like before that you can self-publish things, I like that it was hard. I like that you had to get through a gauntlet of smart people. And yeah, was the game unfair? Yeah, it was, but it was also unfair to me. It was unfair to everybody who sort of had to come in, right? It was maybe fair for a handful of people who lived in New York and had the right connections. But other than that, it wasn't rigged for me. In fact, as a West Coast writer, the game was actually rigged very, very much against me.
The reason that I bring it up is because I actually have a background as an attorney. I was a criminal prosecutor for 3 years, specializing in SVU-based crimes, largely domestic violence. And so you have to qualify experts, right? You have to put them on the stand, and you have to ask them a bunch of questions that qualifies their expertise, and then ask the court permission in order to qualify the witness as an expert, how much they've published, written, interviews, what their work is, right? And so it's kind of been redefined in today's day and age, like we were talking about. And to hear your standard for it's in the back of my mind, because as much as I would love to consider myself an expert in mental resilience or anything like that, I largely base that off of my immersion in whatever I do. I just finished a 58-mile ultra marathon. Last year I did 1,000+ push-ups in 4 hours and all raising charity, putting myself in the field, testing my philosophies and ideas to make sure that I can stand by the strategies that I implement. But to your point, the publication of the theory and having it substantiated with, significant evidence, that's very, not just in the books or the people that you speak to or the immersion, you gotta talk about what and test what you're doing. And like you said, put it out for the world to see.
It's interesting. I'm thinking about this. I'll give you another example. I was looking at a supplement yesterday. Somebody said, hey, have you taken this supplement? And you've seen it. And it's actually it's a friend of mine's company. I know the company, and I know some of the people involved. I'm not going to name it, but they've got a focus supplement that on the bottle it says creates flow, amplifies flow. And I was like, well, that's interesting. What was funny about their ingredients is, so their ingredients amplified acetylcholine and had no caffeine among the other ingredients. That caught my attention because there's only one substance on earth that anybody has ever proven amplifies flow, and it was my lab that did it, and it's caffeine. And the paper ran in Neuroscience and Biobehavior Reviews about a year ago. So one, the supplement doesn't have caffeine. So I was like, okay, that's interesting. That's weird. And two, the thing about acetylcholine that's strange is we've always sort of believed acetylcholine was involved in flow, but we know norepinephrine rises at the front end of the flow state as you transition into it. And norepinephrine and acetylcholine are opposites in the brain. One goes up, the other goes down. It's like serotonin and dopamine. When dopamine goes up, serotonin goes down, and vice versa, as a general rule. And so I'm looking at this thing and I'm like, that's so interesting. Either they did their work and found totally new novel pathways into flow, or this is, marketing. I don't even know what you know what I mean? A word I don't want to say in public right now. Yeah. So I look at stuff like that, and it bothered me, especially with the nutraceutical stuff, One, because I've been in and around that world for a very long time. And, one of the things that you learn if you're in and around that world for like 30 years is that the success rate for products over time is like 5 to 10%, maybe. And most things, and some of this stuff that there was stuff we were taking in the 90s and early thousands that by 2010, we realized was crippling people and messing people up. So I'm a little wary of that stuff, first of all. And I also think the FDA was created the last time there was a free-for-all like this, right? We got massive regulation and that came in, which was in the late 1800s, where the term snake oil originally comes from, right? And when we were putting cocaine and Coca-Cola and heroin was in most of our pain over-the-counter painkillers. So again, gatekeepers, the same kind of question, what do you do? How do you not squelch innovation? And ultimately, I believe in free markets. I think the market is a great arbiter in the end. I think it works really, really well if you've got fair and free markets. I think something I always say to other authors, I'm like, you may not like it, but the amount of copies your book sells is actually a reflection of how the public feels about your book. It may not be the quality of the book. They may be wrong, right? The mainstream is wrong about a bunch of shit all the time. They call that television.
It's funny that you talk about it like that, like market validation, right?
But it is. There's something real about it, and artists don't like it. And I'm like, well, I don't know. Everybody else sort of has to live under this system of judgment that we've created. And ultimately, this is one of the advantages of writing 14 books and having a long career is you ultimately okay, I see it. I see the ones that didn't hit, and I see the ones that hit, and I can tell what the difference is, and I know why, and I think everybody's wrong, and you're missing my brilliant,
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Inside the Inspired. My name is Jonathan Cohen, and I have a quick favor to ask you. If you're getting any value out of this content, please take a second to subscribe to the channel. You help us reach more people, and you can also stay up to date with all the latest content coming your way. Thank you so much for tuning in. Expertise, right? You talk about mindset from a few different perspectives. I've heard you outline Carol Dweck talk about the attitude towards learning as part of mindset, or your co-author, colleague, friend, Peter Diamandis, mindset is attitude towards life. How you define the role of mindset in today's day and age. Why is it so important?
I think most of the time when people say mindset these days, what they mean is what psychology would call a frame, right? An attitude. The difference is when it impacts information. For a mindset to really be a mindset, what Carol Dweck discovered, for example, about the fixed and the growth mindset, is that there are neurobiological differences when a fixed mindset versus a growth mindset process information. I'll give you another one that's really challenging today, because we live in a cult of trauma. Everybody wants extra credit for having survived the hardships of life. And I'm not denying that life is hard. I think it's hard for all of us. Nobody gets out of here alive. But today's culture wants extra credit. Everybody wants extra credit for their trauma. And this is problematic for a lot of reasons. But one, every time you retell your story, right? I'm trauma bonding, I'm trauma sharing, I have PT, blah, blah, blah. You're laying that memory down again, and you're reactivating it. It's a victim mindset. And psychologists, the victim mindset, the technical term is an external locus of control, right? Life happens to me. I don't have any power here. And versus an internal locus of control, I control my life. That's a true mindset. Why? Because when you have an external locus of control and you encounter a challenge, your brain will not even start to generate the energy you need to meet the challenge, because your brain will go, yeah, you're going to fail anyways. Life happens to you. You've got no power here. I'm not going to bother burning the calories. This is what a fixed mindset does too. When you make an error and you have a fixed mindset, your brain doesn't try to learn from the information, because you don't believe learning is possible, right? You think innate intelligence is innate and you're born that way and you can't grow and you can't learn. So the brain won't even bother spending the energy to try to learn. The brain is very focused on conserving energy, and it's first order business for the brain. So the reason the victim mindset, the external locus of control, is so tricky is it literally blocks our ability to get into flow. Flow is a high energy state. It's how we're all hardwired for peak performance. And if you believe life happens to you and you have no control, you can't generate the energy to get into flow. So those things are sort of rippling towards performance. When Peter talks about things like the abundance mindset, this scarcity mindset, scarcity mindset is actually probably something of a like what that is probably like a negativity bias, and there are like different terms for that. But true mindsets impact us like biases, right? They work at an unconscious level and shape how the brain processes information. But fundamental for peak performance and obviously important for flow for reasons we talked about.
How do we hack peak performance?
Well, I don't love the term as it implies shortcut, and I haven't found one. I found only one thing. And this is not my idea. So this is godfather of psychology, William James, one of my great heroes, said something very similar back in 1891 in the first psychology textbook ever written. Peak performance is nothing more or less than getting our biology to work for us rather than against us. Flow is at the center of that biology, but there's more going on. The flow is at the dead center of that. So you can cognitive literacy and understanding what's going on in your brain and your body. Like this is sort of to me how you do it. But let's just talk about flow because it's the quick and dirty one before we run out of time, so we can make good on your promise that we're going to tell people how to get more flow in their lives, right? The thing to know is that flow states have triggers, preconditions that lead to more flow. And there are 28 that have been discovered. There's probably way more, but those triggers are your toolkit. We can go into greater detail for sure. But the high level thing to know is flow follows focus. It only shows up when all our attention is the right here, right now. So that's essentially what all the triggers do. They do it different ways in the brain, but they all drive our attention into the present moment in a really extreme way. So along those lines, some of the obvious triggers, risk is clearly a flow trigger. Why did you see so much flow in action sports? It's one of the reasons. Risk focuses our attention on the present. It doesn't have to be physical risk, right? Fear of public speaking is the number one fear in the world, and public speaking is very flowy. You know this. You do speeches, really flowy activity. For the same reason, novelty, complexity, unpredictability, all these things catch and hold our attention. They all work as flow triggers. So let me just give you a simple example of novelty, then I'll shut up. So I have to read a lot of neuroscience textbooks, and they're obviously they're thick, they're hard. And if I'm in flow, learning, according to the studies done by the Department of Defense, goes up 240 to 500% in flow. It's a huge spike above baseline for a bunch of reasons we could talk about, but I want to read in flow. And so one of the things I always like to do is I like to take my textbooks on the road, and I'll go like check into usually it's like some mountain cabin basically in the middle of nowhere with a huge view of kind of awe-inspiring nature, because that's novelty. Complexity also in the environment, which is what produces awe. It's a natural world, so unpredictable things happen. Hawks fly through, moose run by, that sort of stuff. And it's just enough to usually sort of that plus the I'm away from the world, complete concentration, plus that little bit of extra novelty. It's enough to get neurochemicals like dopamine flowing in my system and prime the brain for flow. So that's a really simple example, but if you going to a coffee shop across town to do some work can have the same effect.
You talk about grit and thought control, but not necessarily grit in the way Angela Duckworth talks about grit. It's kind of and forgive me if I'm speaking on your behalf, I would love to help the audience rationalize, or maybe even myself rationalize. What do you mean by the grit to control your thoughts?
Angela has defined and I love Angela Duckworth's work, and I think she's brilliant, but I disagree a little bit with this. She defines grit as the intersection so she talks about it as the intersection of passion and perseverance. I don't think of it that way. I think grit is what you need once the passion runs out, right? And if you take this into the practical and you go into the world and you talk to top performers across the lens, well, what do you mean by grit? You hear there are 6 categories that people talk about training for, right? And the first, which is clearly the most ancient in terms of its history, because all the wisdom traditions talk about this, is thought control, right? The grit to control your thoughts. So to still your thoughts, and quiet everything upstairs. Now, obviously, you want to do this for flow. Neurobiologically, one of the things that happens in flow is the prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain that's right back here, turns off large swatches of it. This is why time passes strangely and your sense of self goes away. Those are things that are sort of created, processed, calculated by the prefrontal cortex. And so it's sort of like a network effect. And as the part of the network go down, we lose like the ability to distinguish past from present from future. So we're plunged into that deep now experience that you have in flow, right? That's the prefrontal cortex is turning off. If you can't control your thoughts, when your thoughts are spinning, when you're in your head and in your ego, that's all prefrontal cortex. So it's blocking flow, right? So this is why the godfather of attention science, Michael Posner, said back in I want to say the 70s, maybe the 80s, early 80s, but like 40, 50 years ago, he said, I'll bet meditation works as a flow trigger or a flow hack. Now that's been borne out, a lot, and we're actually, certain kinds of meditation are better for certain other things. And there's varieties, and we can do comparative sort of studies on like, this is when you do Vipassana versus focused meditation versus love and kindness. And these are the situations. So it's gotten really precise, but the grit to control your thoughts. And, there's a lot of different ways in, but one way or another, like reframing is a tool. So is mindfulness, and really, you talked about at the beginning of the show. It's about emotional control, right? There's a gap between emotion, which is the raw neurobiological sensation in your body, and feeling, which is when I'm feeling sadness, I'm feeling happy, right? Once you name the thing, it's got so much energy, it's off to the races. You have no hope of stopping it, right? But if you can, and we've all felt this, like if you can get in, like between, like the moment that kind of the emotion of anger arises and the point that you're angry, you can reframe it and maybe have a slight calm yourself down and a slightly better decision. We've all done this, with our loved ones, where like you're about to start screaming at them and then you realize like, oh, that's your mother and she raised you, and no, you're not going to write, and you reframe it and you don't do that. That's sort of thought control and emotional control. What's funny about that particular one, even if I've been meditating for 30 years and I've like gone into scanners and had people look at my brain while I'm meditating to make sure I do it right. Because like if this is the thought control I got after 30 years, like this is slow freaking progress. That's all I got to say. This is like a slow, long lifetime uphill battle, or like everybody else is much better at it than me. But like I've literally gone into fMRIs and been like, look at my brain while I'm meditating. Tell me if I'm doing it right. Because like, wow, is this slow progress?
For me, thought control, first time I never even come across the concept of it, is what kind of set me down this entire path. I've now come to understand it as, self-regulation. And it's kind of a big mission of mine to normalize that, where it's not just, emotional management, but like truly seeing yourself, to your point, as this neurobiological organism that can regulate themselves on command. And that obviously requires awareness and, positive self-talk, something else we talk a lot about on this show, a lot of stuff that gets shunned as woo-woo to a degree. There's actual and evidence-based approach that you highlight in your work. Why is positive self-talk so important?
Well, so there's thin lines here, okay? So affirmations tend to be disasters. Positive self-talk tend to work, and gratitude really works. And it's because we have a bullshit detector in the brain. And if you're looking in the mirror and saying, I'm a millionaire, and your brain is going, dude, you work at Walmart, right? That's demotivated. You're lying to yourself. Gratitude is, I'm so happy and grateful that I woke up this morning, I can breathe. And like, it's something that already happened. So like, you're just reminding your brain that good things happen to you, which makes you feel a little bit safer, and it lowers your negativity bias and things like that. Positive self-talk is, I always think, I love what Dr. Michael Gervais, my friend Mike Gervais, says here. He says, positive self-talk, those thoughts expand and you can feel them. They expand you versus contracting, right? You can feel those kinds of thoughts. I think of it in those terms. And one of the positive self-talks help for two reasons. One is that confidence is very much correlated with one of flow's main triggers, which is known as the challenge skills balance. This is often called the golden rule of flow. The idea is flow follows focus, as I mentioned, so that we pay the most attention to the task at hand when the challenge of that task slightly exceeds our skill set. So you want to stretch but not snap, right? It's a little bit outside your comfort zone. That there's a little bit of risk, there's a little bit of excitement, there's a little bit of challenge, but you're not overwhelmed, you're not freaked out, you're not paralyzed by what you're doing. And so in the 90s, a bunch of European psychologists and neurobiologists started to ask the question, well, what the fuck do you mean by challenge and skills? Like, those are vague terms. What could we possibly mean? And a random example, but Susan Jackson, Flow in Sports, actually, this is where that study lives. But there was a study that she did about college athletes. So, right, Division I college athletes, 81% of what they meant by skills was actually confidence. So, some large portion of what the brain thinks of as a skill set is actually our confidence about our skills and our ability to execute. That's part of it. Certainly, we know from all our research into people who have accomplished the impossible, you have to be able to sort of see it as possible in your mind before it becomes possible in reality, which has to do with a lot of pattern recognition things along those lines. I think false optimism isn't going to do you any good, but real, like sort of rational optimism also makes you more flow prone. And a lot of this has to do with how the brain processes information, the information bottlenecks that we suffer from. Like, let's talk about the negativity bias for a second. The brain takes in every like 9 bits of negative information for every positive bit that gets through. Those positive bits, those new bits, are what we use for creative problem solving and innovation. That's the seeds of that. And if you're negative all the time, that's the ratio, and you're not going to get those novel bits of information because there's only your attention, for example, can process 120 bits of information at once. So that's like consciousness is a really limited amount of things we can pay attention to at once. And if it's dominated by negative stuff, all the things that we use to seed creativity and even the novelty that needs to get through for flow doesn't get through, we block it. So there's a lot of neurobiology around it, but and I mean, some of it is like, you have people like Louise Hayes who've written, millions of books on affirmations that totally disagree with what I just, said, though she doesn't have any science to back that up. So there's this woo-woo side of this, right, where the people don't realize that positive self-talk is this psychological term that actually comes out of sports psychology, right, and how do athletes talk to themselves during the game kind of thing. And it bled into, a lot of it was combat stuff. Right, both martial arts and how do we train soldiers and things like that, and how do they talk to themselves in their heads during combat situations, and who comes back without PTSD, comes back with PTSD, that sort of thing.
In the few minutes that we have left, there's a couple more questions I have for you. How do you see artificial intelligence impacting flow research or peak performance as we move into this next era?
It's a funny question because we've been using AI for a really long time, right? I mean, like my chief science officer, Dr. Michael Menino, runs the largest, or I think he just stepped down, but until 2 weeks ago, he ran the largest graduate AI program in America. Out of his 5 colleges that banded together in Florida to run this program, and so we've been working with AI for a lot, and Peter Diamandis and myself are writing a new book right now. And Peter and I are both in agreement that by like 2030, there's 2 kinds of companies in the world, those built on AI and those that are business. So I think this is the future. I also think the future is humans in flow collaborating with AI. So I think that's really important to understand that there are a bunch of things that happen to the brain in flow that allow us to cooperate better with AI. I can go into a lot of detail if you want, but if you're really and if AI is going to impact our jobs and what we're doing for a living, adaptive flexibility is going to be the key. How do you re-skill? How do you learn new things? How do you pivot? And that's all sort of flow-based. Essentially, it's very hard to train adaptive flexibility, which is sort of at the heart of resilience, but you can train flow, and flow automatically makes you more flexible in that way. So it's a good way to step into that. So I think AI is real. It's here. It's going to keep growing. I don't think it's going to take our jobs, all our jobs. It's not. It's not. I mean, maybe I'm wrong on this one, but like that's not what has happened historically. Every new technology has created far more jobs than it's ever taken, and we've had this fear again and again and again and again. I also think we are somewhat in the middle of an AI hype cycle, right? Like, remember the metaverse? Remember when what's his name stood up on stage and said, "Oh, the metaverse," and I was like, "Really? That's interesting." Because boy, I've been looking at VR tech for like 30 years, and I don't see it. Like, but okay, the metaverse, right? Yeah, where is it now? Where's the metaverse today? Exactly. Which is not to say that we won't get a metaverse, but it's like, the hype cycle on this stuff, it gets very loud, and it also doesn't change the fact that historically, doesn't matter. Like one of the things that I care about is how are we using technology to solve basic standards of living, to raise basic standards of living. This is something we talked about in abundance and bold. Peter and I really care a lot about this. And one of the things that we've seen over and over and over again is it takes a generation for a technology to spread through a culture. And that has not changed. So, it's moving so fast. It's moving so fast. It's moving so fast. Exactly. And your parents got onto Facebook when? Right?
Yeah.
Right. Can they send email yet? Like, are they on Facebook? You know what I mean? There's always a bottleneck with that one as well.
I want to give some attention to this class I'm about to speak to. This university, Torah University, is currently reading your book, Bold, and the name of the class is called Moonshots. It's an entrepreneurial-based class. Can you offer some insight, some words of wisdom as to what you hope the students can take away and actionably implement as they go and venture off into their careers?
One, the first thing I want to say, like, please don't start a company just so you can build it and sell it and try to get rich. Like, don't go unicorn hunting. The world doesn't need any more of that crap. Like, really enough already. But the cool thing about Bold is I think that book is a blueprint. Like, more people have used that book to launch companies than any other book in history. I'll tell you a really funny story about that. So, you want to talk about anybody being able to do anything? I met a guy in New York City. I'm literally like Daniel Kahneman, Dr. Kahneman, and I did just done a speech together. And I'm standing outside of where we spoke. And this guy comes up to me. There's a bunch of people around. And he says, "God, I used your book, Bold, to start a company." And I hear that story all the time. So I'm always like fascinated. Okay, tell me your story. He says, "My story is crazy." And I was like, "Okay, tell me your story." He's like, "So I go hunting every year with my brother, and I hate to hunt. My brother's a hunter. I hate hunting. I just go to hang out with my brother, and I bring a bunch of books, and I sit in the deer blind, and I read books. And I'm reading Bold, and I'm in the deer blind, and I've got my cell phone with me, and I check, and I realize I've got some bars." He's like, "So I used all the things you wrote in Bold to launch a company. While from the deer blind, I launched a solar energy referral company from the deer blind that is now like an 8 or 9 figure business." Wow. From a deer blind, right? Using a cell phone. Wow. And this was like 2014 or 15 technology. I think it just, it speaks to what was actually possible then and still possible now. But God is, on the other side of it is, I started with it. We don't need somebody else to start another, like, I just want to make money company. But I'm somebody who's helped start or started 16 different companies at this point. Like, I spent my life as an entrepreneur, and I don't know how to work for anybody else. Like, I would just get fired, right? So I'm very much wired this way, and I'm very much, Peter and I, the one thing we totally always agree on is the power of moonshots. Yeah, and you have to remember, I saw it up close. People look at Peter Diamandis very differently. He's been my friend for 30 years. So I remember when Peter wanted to open the space frontier, and he had this idea called the X Prize, and everybody thought the idea of somebody building a private spaceship was freaking nuts. And for a bunch of different reasons, I thought Peter was right. Everybody else thought he was wrong. It had to do with like weird rocket science journalism stories that I had done before I met Peter. So I was like, oh, this guy isn't crazy. Everybody else thinks he's crazy. But like 30 years later, sort of like I watched my friend Peter open the space frontier. And it's now, $1 trillion industry. And that's what it looked like. And same thing in Squaw Valley. It wasn't like, these every I met struck me as extraordinary. They struck me as normal people who went out and were accomplishing the impossible. This is the other thing that what I saw. We write about flow and bold, and certainly like entrepreneurs and flow. That's how great companies get built.
Stephen, I've had an awesome time hanging out with you today. I feel like I could ask you questions for another hour, or just hang out for another hour. Hopefully one day get the chance to train with you. Please let the audience know where they can keep up with your journey.
Yes, StephenKotler.com is me. FlowResearchCollective.com is the Flow Research Collective. And I'm at Stephen Kotler on social media. Come say hello.
Thank you so much for your time.